helped me to sing it today, and for everyone else, your familiarity with Humberto's ideas, I'm sure will enable you to pick up the words very quickly and hopefully to join in and sing along. It's really easier if we all stand up. It's in 6/8 time, so the appropriate sort of dance movement is a lurch or a slow gallop or something. So please sing along when you pick up a line or two. I am an autonomous unity, my structure is very profound. While everything else is aligned to me I am perfectly round. My history, mystery, I will unveil, believing I know as I do. This world I bring forth is my own, and I love your autopoietical view. Not hypothetical, just parenthetical, autopoietical view. I am an autonomous unity, my structure is very profound. While everything else is aligned to me I am perfectly round. My history, mystery, I will unveil, believing I know as I do. This world I bring forth is my own, and I love your autopoietical view. Not hypothetical, just parenthetical, autopoietical view. I am an autonomous unity, my structure is very profound. While everything else is aligned to me I am perfectly round. My history, mystery, I will unveil, believing I know as I do. This world I bring forth is my own, and I love your autopoietical view. Not hypothetical, just parenthetical, autopoietical view.
Thank you, beautiful. In fact, it's beautiful.
Thank you.
Very well. Since the whole, what I have to say has already been sung to existence, there is nothing else I can say. Whatever I shall say now is adornment on this beautiful song. I shall provide material for a new one. I wish to speak about the origin of human beings, both biologically and culturally. Now there is, of course, as you know, a history of a conflict or an opposition between what is genetically determined and what is obtained or developed in the individual history, in the culture, the whole controversy, nurture versus nature versus nurture. Well, in a way, presented as it has been along in the beginning of the century, this is inadequate because it's an extreme. What one can say in very general terms for systems is that whichever be the case of the system, as it has an initial structure, this initial structure is the founding condition. And that initial structure allows the realization of an organization which defines the identity of the system in interaction with the medium. And this is always the case. And it's always the case that the history of existence of such entity will follow certain characteristics in which the initial structure constitute the conditions of possibility of whatever else comes, yet does not determine it. A history of interactions must take place. At the same time, nothing will arise in this history of interactions which is not possible as a transformation of the initial structure. But nothing in the initial structure specifies what will happen afterwards by itself, because a history of transformations must take place, and such a history takes place both as a result of an internal dynamics and as a result of the interactions of the system in a medium. For that, in biology exists a word which is called epigenesis. Almost to be used as a synonymous for development, but it's not quite development. The word development suggests more that something is already here that unfolds, but this is not exactly that the case. Something is there that is the initial condition, but it is not an unfolding, it's a transformation. So much is a transformation that if you have different histories of interactions, you have different transformations. At the same time, if you have several systems in which the initial structure is repeated and the history of interactions is also repeated, then you can expect, obviously, the same history of transformations. And that happens to the extent that that happens. You and your friend can go and buy two identical cars. You have equal expectation that these beautiful cars will last in perfect condition so many years. And one goes out and hits another car 2 blocks away, while the other not. So different histories of interactions, different history of transformation. But the transformations that the car underwent as a result of the collision that took place 2 blocks away from the factory is determined by the structure of the car. A car made differently under the same collision will have undergone different structural changes. So the notion of epigenesis should provide us with an understanding, or at least with a view, which frees us, liberates us from this controversy of how much is determined by the genetics of an organism and how much by the medium. Both participate, and participate differently according to the characteristics of the organisms and the characteristics of the history of interactions. There are organisms which have very small domain of variability in development. Those require very restrictive and repetitive conditions of interactions in the history of the organism, and so you have highly repetitive situations. There are other organisms in which there is a tremendous diversity possible for different history of interactions, and then you can have a whole variety of courses of individual histories. So this varies, and of course varies with initial constitution. varies, let us say, when speaking about living systems with its genetics constitution. Now, at the same time, what is taking place is that a history or the history of any system takes place as variations around what is conserved. Any system that you wish, in its proper domain of existence, in the proper domain in which it is distinguished as a totality, will last as such as long as the organization that defines it is conserved, and will have a history of changes around the conservation of that organization that defines it. Structure will change around the conservation of the organization that defines the identity of that system. Now, that is very clear for individual history. But it is also the case for succession of individuals, for generations. If one looks at the notion of epigenesis, if one realizes that whatever happens in the life history of an organism is this continuous interplay of the transformations of an initial structure in a domain of interactions and the conditions of conservation of a particular organization and the circumstances in which the congruence with the medium is conserved, because if the congruence with the medium is not conserved, the interactions are not perturbation, on the contrary, they are destructive interactions. It turns out that whatever is conserved in a system is a particular manner of being. The individual history of a system, or what is conserved in the individual history of a system, is a particular manner of being, which is, if there are succession of generation, reappear generation after generation. Now, let me take a simple example. You go to the countryside and you find a frog. You pick up the frog, examine the frog, and say, aha, this is such and such a species. And you give the name of the species. You know it, you have examined this, you have studied zoology, or you have been interested in animals, you recognize the species. Ranapipians, for example, very common species in North America. I work with Ranapipians. This is why I mention it. But then you go more and you find a tadpole. You pick up the tadpole and examine it and say, Ranapipians. Now you compare the tadpole with the adult fellow, they are very different. They live in different media. The tadpole lives permanently in water, the adult comes out, and so on and so forth. The adult has legs, the tadpole has the shape of a little fish, or something like a little fish, and yet you say Ranapipians. Looking around, you may still find some eggs or some little embryos, and you say Ranapipians. What are you identifying? All these little entities, or these various entities, are completely different. What are you identifying? You are identifying a manner of living that extends from the initial cell to the adult life in its reproduction or its death, depending on how you're looking. A manner of living. And when this animal reproduces, what reproduces? What is reproduced, excuse me? A manner of living. an egg is produced such that a manner of living appears which is, if it is reproduced, the same as the manner of living of the progenitor. So, a species is a collection of individuals that share a manner of living. A lineage is a succession of individuals produced reproductively, defined by the conservation of a manner of living, reproduction after reproduction. I call that manner of living ontogenic phenotype, and you will forgive me to give the name ontogenic phenotype. Ontogenic because covers the expanse of the whole life of the organism, from its beginning as an egg, as a zygote, to its end after reproduction or ultra-production, whichever the case, as an adult. The whole expanse of the life of the organism. And phenotype because corresponds to the manner of encountering with the medium, which is different from the genotype in biology, which refers to the genetic constitution. In biology, there is these two terms, genotype and phenotype. The genotype has to do with what is called the genetic constitution, and the phenotype is that which is realized or appears in the encounter of the organism with the medium. But if you look at this, in these terms, you may realize, and I shall tell this to you, and please, I'm not necessarily, if you are not particularly involved in biology, I'm not necessarily demanding from you to remember this specially, but at least to know that frequently biologists say that the phenotype is that part of the genotype that is expressed. I claim that this is not the case. The phenotype arises in the living. It's not that part of the genotype that is expressed. The genotype and the total genotype is the initial constitution. So nothing that happens here in history is predetermined here. Not even determined here, although it arises in a deterministic manner. It's constituted in the process of history. So when I speak about the phenotype or the ontogenic phenotype, I'm referring at that which happens in history of living, starting from an initial condition, but not predetermined in it. But the lineage then would take place whenever you have a system that is reproduced, and here you have an ontogenic history, and then you have here another initial structure that will give rise, if the proper conditions take place, to the same manner of living. Now, there happens a systemic phenomenon. No organism puts its descendants in just any place. Not because there is a manner of living which results in that the descendants are placed in a particular place, which has to do with that manner of living. So, as reproduction takes place, the new organism begins its life as an independent entity in a particular place that is, I do not want to say chosen, but appears in the realization of the manner of living of the parents. And when this itself realizes the same manner of living, deposits its descendants in a place which is comparable to the place in which it was itself being placed. And if this repeats and repeats, you have a lineage. So you have a manner of stabilization of the manner of living by the realization of the manner of living, generation after generation. Now this is interesting. Once a manner of living is constituted, it either stabilizes itself because as it realizes, create the conditions such that the new generation will realize the same manner of living. And when this happens, a lineage is established or not. And when that does not happen, a shift in manner of living will take place and a new lineage will appear. Now, I have given to you, in these very few words, the fundamental processes involved in evolution. And I have done it without reference to genetics. Not because genetics does not participate, but because genetics that does not determine it. The manner of living is not determined genetically, is determined in the actual realization of a history of interactions in which both initial structure and circumstances, medium, participate. So, whenever a manner of living is conserved generation after generation, a lineage is formed. And whenever a lineage is formed, the members of that lineage can undergo variations in their structure around the conservation of that manner of living. And occasionally, a new lineage may arise when some variations around the conservation of the manner of living of the old lineage begin to be conserved as part of a new manner of living which constitutes, by being conserved generation after generation, a new lineage. Now, this is valid in the history of living systems, and this is valid also in cultures. And I shall say about that something in a moment. So, if we accept that we human beings are like other living beings, the result or the present better of a particular evolutionary history, and we want to understand our origin, we must find out by actual argumenting that this was the case, or by whatever criterion of observation we claim that would give us an argument to say that that was the case, the manner of living that was conserved when our lineage was constituted, or the variations of a fundamental manner of living such that through those variations a lineage arose which is our own. Can we say something about the human manner of living? Yes, we can say a few things. We can say that we have certain features in our manner of living. Remember, the manner of living is the whole organism in its relation to its circumstances, in its realization as such, and hence entails the structural dynamics and the physiology and the behavior. Now, we human beings are a particular kind of animal which has a manner of living that entails the development, the biological development as mammalians, with mammalian characteristics, with primate characteristics, which live in a special way. Are bipedal, we are bipedal animals, manipulators of our environment, immersed in languaging and emotioning. This is essentially what is the manner of living of human beings. I could synthesize it: bipedal primates, manipulators of the environment that live in languaging and emotioning. Does this apply to Chileans? Yes. Does this apply to Australians? Yes. Does this apply to Australian Aborigines? Yes. Does this apply to Chinese? Yes. Yes. In fact, we would have doubts about the humanity of some primate that is not living in language and emotioning, braided with languaging. As a manner of living. I mean, occasionally we find some human beings that for some reason or another do not develop language, and we know that this being belongs to us because of its origin in reproduction. Yet we leave it as alien to us because it does not belong to languaging with us. As a special case. A child that has been treated in a special manner or grown in a special manner, an autistic child, for example, extreme autistic child is something that we say is a human child, and yet something has happened there. Now, we may have different attitudes with respect to the possibilities that this being becomes human in its fullness or not, or whether its humanity is hidden, restricted, or caged, so to speak, in a particular behavior or not. But the fact is that as we encounter this being, we are in trouble. Physically, we recognize ourselves in it. Behaviorally, we do not. And sometimes this is so extreme that we put these people in a different place, in an alien's house. Yes?
Can I just confirm, when you use the word language, most of the time you're using it in the ordinary sense to mean simple
Talking? No. No. I have said already what languaging is.
Yes, but there seems to be a suggestion that...
No. Coordinations of consensual behaviors.
Because the way you were just using it tended to imply...
No. I mean, with an extreme autistic child, you have tremendous difficulty of getting coordinations of behavior. Or with other people that for some other reason you say they are alien, they're crazy. Now, what usually happens, of course, is that these persons that have been developed as normal human beings and have been then altered, they are not fully outside languaging. But I have to say more about this question of language. So if we want to understand and to be able to say something about the origin of human beings, what we have to look is to the... by the way, I'm speaking about the conditions of constitution all the time. I'm not speaking about the human beings as such entities that I have to go there and find them because they have a transcendental existence, or that I have the ability to recognize them because I have this endowment or something of this sort. I'm speaking about the conditions of constitution of human beings. So if we want to understand our origin, if what I have said about the manner of living of human being is acceptable, then we have to look for the manner of living in our ancestors that either was already as our own or gave origin to some of the configuration of features that constitute our manner of living in one moment of that history. particularly, I would say, in relation to languaging. Now, what can one say in relation to that? One can say the following. Notice that this, of course, is a construction of history. It's a proposition for understanding with some fundamental grounding in interpretation or using experience to explain experience in the domain of evolution. It is presently known that there are fossil remains in Africa of about 3.5 million years ago of bipedal primates of about this size. That they were bipedal can be recognized by the skeleton. That they were of the same kind of us can also be recognized by the skeleton. They had feet like our feet, shoulders like our shoulders, hands like our hands, the general shape of the head comparable with teeth which resemble our teeth. And the discussion is, are these or are not these remains of beings that are directly our ancestors? Or are there more ancestors of other branches of this hominoid family? If these were not directly our ancestors, something similar to these beings could have been our ancestors. So I shall propose that there are remains that allow us to say certain things about beings that lived 3.5 million years ago as bipedal animals with certain characteristics in their living that we can suppose by looking to the remains that we have of them. They were bipedal. They were gatherers because they have the teeth of animals which eat seeds, nuts, insects, larvae of insects. They do not have the teeth of animals which are carnivores. Or they may have been scavengers, eating the remains also of other animals killed by other animals, carnivores. But they're essentially, they have the teeth of animals that eat seeds. Presumably seeds of grass that can be taken out with the hands and looking at them and separating them or collecting them from the ground. Maybe already digging for roots. 3.5 million years ago. We also know that the brain size of these beings was about, in terms of brain capacity, 450 cubic centimeters. Brain cubic centimeters. And in the present, I would say that human brain is of the order of plus or minus 1,450 cubic centimeters. Doesn't matter if it's 400 or a little bit more, it's about that. There are variations. If these fellows are our ancestors, a history has taken place in which brain size has grown, face has changed. What else has changed? How did they live? Well, they were collectors, gatherers, and we. I claim that we are gatherers too. True that we are agricultural being, we plant food, but what do? We gather on what we plant. Now, one would say it's a very fundamentally different thing to plant than to be a gatherer in which one collects things that are there. Yes, it is and it is not. How our gathering being appears. I say that the success of supermarkets is due to our gathering characteristic. I mean, the supermarket is a forest, a savanna where you go and pick up things, and you are a gatherer. I mean, we have a great joy. I mean, we are very comfortable in supermarkets. And it's much better to be moving around than having somebody else asking, what do you want? What do you want? What do you want to buy? No, it's comfort. You go around, pick up, leave things. Oh. If we go to the countryside, we enjoy gathering wild fruits or other things. So I think that these fellows were gatherers. We can tell through their teeth and through many of their characteristics, and we are gatherers. Yes?
What succession of transformations may have occurred whereby the original gatherers presumably stopped gathering when they'd gathered enough to eat, and we go on gathering?
You are right. That's a good question. Okay, but we shall come to that when we speak about culture. Maybe there we find some answer, some possibility of understanding. Did these people share food? Now, sharing is a very interesting thing. Sharing is not letting the other be beside you or eat besides you. Sharing food consists in handling. Birds, when they feed their young, frequently share food. The parents bring the food and the little fellows open the beak and the food is given to the little one. From the adult, sometimes is regurgitate. There are some wild dogs that share food. They have a campament in which the old animals and the females with young remain while the others go hunting, hunt, eat, come back and regurgitate food which is eaten by the old and by the females and the children that have remained in one place. So sharing is not by itself something extraordinary among animals. But if you do not have the biology of sharing, you do not share. What I was saying about this initial condition. This initial condition does not specify what will happen in history. But nothing can happen in the history of a living system that its initial condition does not permit as a possibility of transformation if the proper history takes place. Now, can we say that we are spontaneously sharing animals? I would say yes. There are many situations in which spontaneity of sharing appears. Children, very little children, take out the food from the mouth and give it to other children or to the father or to the mother. And this is done, you don't have to tell. On the contrary, you tell not to do it because, oh, look, I mean, bacteria. So children, little children, share food spontaneously. Well, we share food as a matter of course, not necessarily by cultural injunction, but as a matter of course in a relationship of intimacy with somebody else whom we love and accept. We may not share to the whole world, but with the persons that we have chosen or that with whom we are in enjoyment, we share. I think that sharing in modern human beings is biologically grounded. It's not a cultural invention. And not only because the biology for sharing must be there, but because it appears, is present in early childhood. So we belong to a history of sharing. We are the present of a history of sharing that necessarily must be how long? Do other primates share food? No. Occasionally it says that chimpanzees share meat when they hunt. Yes?
Isn't it true that everything that we do is biologically grounded on the basis of your...
Yes. No. What I say is nothing can happen in the history of an organism that biology does not permit. But does not necessarily mean that it will necessarily happen. You require a history. So whatever happens here requires a biological condition that permits it. Yes. But what I want to say when I insist in this sharing is that it's a very fundamental thing in us. It's so fundamental thing that it does even appear spontaneously in childhood.
It's one of the original manners of living.
Exactly. What I'm trying to say is that it's so fundamental now that I can assume or presume that was part of the original of the manner of living here. Gatherers, sharing. We can also say that these ancestors of ours, direct or indirect ancestors, lived in small groups. And we can say that they lived in small groups because perchance the small group has been fossilized, they seem to have been caught in a cave either by a falling roof or by some situation, and you have a whole group of about 10 or 12 people, which includes adults, male and female, children, and baby. And this is not a hunting group. When you have all that spectrum of ages, means that you have a group that live together. Now, do we live in small groups? Yes, we do live in small groups. Even this big city like Melbourne is subdivided in hundreds or thousands of small groups, which are the families. And if the family is too small, we are not very comfortable. If it is too large, we are not comfortable either. Small group means of the order of, I don't know, 10 perhaps, around that, adults, children, various kinds of adults. So small groups. Did the male participate in child care? Now, of the apes, of the big primates, we know that the gibbons and the siamangs participate, the males participate in child care. Not the chimpanzees or the gorillas, but the siamangs and the participate. But do we, human males, have the biology for child care? Yes, we do it. I mean, every human male knows that he has the biology for child care, and if culture does not tell him, look, this is a women's responsibility, you do everything of child care. We cannot breastfeed the child, we cannot be pregnant for a child, but we do all we know. We have the biology for doing all that is related to child care. Now, no biological trait is there without a history. Now, we cannot claim the moment in this history in which the participation of the male became from an occasional phenomenon part of the manner of living. But if we now have the biology of child care, we must belong to a history in which that was a possibility or even was a practice, was part of the manner of living. Indeed, in our modern times, male participation in child care is part of the manner of living. Restricted, but it's part of the manner of living. Besides, in this history, a particular phenomenon has taken place which is called neoteny. Neoteny. I don't know if it's written like this, which means that as the generations have gone by, infancy has been prolonged so that the adulthood has been delayed and perhaps in some cases almost completely disappear in terms of the characteristics of the adult. And when sexual maturity and reproduction takes place, they take place in a being that is infant-like. I was once looking in the zoo in Santiago, a place with baboons, a big area with baboons, and was very remarkable the following. There were old male baboons with their big mane sitting in the periphery of this place. I'm not saying that this is the normal distribution of baboons in the wild, and I'm speaking about what happened in the zoo. And they were accompanied by one or two females grooming. Yep. I think there were 3 big males. There were children playing around, running, jumping, and there was a female that had a little baby. Now, the interesting thing is that this female that had a little baby was not alone. She was followed by a court of other females and young females and young males. She moved around with her baby, all the others move around her. So these young males, which were a little bit bigger than these very children, and sometimes there were children there, were interested in the baby. Bigger ones were not interested in the baby. But the little one, I mean, these young males, not only the young females, but the young males were interested in the baby. Now, I mention this because maybe that to be interested, male interest in baby is a childish behavior. But we are neotenic animals. We human adults have characteristic of children compared with other primates. So we belong to a history in which in some moment in this history male participation in child care was part of the manner of living, still part of our manner of living, perhaps more present than now, which had to do with this neoteny. The human baby, compared with the babies of other primates, is practically a fetus. It's an underdeveloped thing, which is you leave it there, dies. I mean, here you leave the baby and you go away. The baby cries unless you go back and pick it up. Has no chance. But in other primates, the little baby clings to the mother. No, the mother doesn't leave it, of course, but clings to the mother. I just want to emphasize that there is this neoteny, this prolongation of infancy, and with some infantile characteristics. Maybe some features of human adults' playfulness, curiosity, have to do with our being neotenic animals. So, male participation in child care. But there is something more. Yes?
And there's a piece of biological evidence which I don't think quite fits in with that, and that's the falling age of sexual maturity. That across the century there's been evidence to suggest that children are becoming sexually mature earlier rather than later.
Well, I don't think that this doesn't fit with it. Certainly, you see, none of these things. I shall say a few things more about evolutionary change, but these things are not fixed, do not have to remain in only one direction. Maybe that has to do with changes in other aspects of the manner of living that accompany that.
Or diet.
Or diets and things of the sort. So I have no answer to that, but at the same time I say that is not necessarily a contradiction to this, but certainly may reveal that this is a plastic situation. The other characteristic that these ancestors of us must have had is sensuality. Sensual beings. Well, because they are mammals. Mammals touch each other. If you have a dog, if you have a cat, they touch you. I mean, the cat goes to sleep in your bed. It approaches you to be in touch. If you come home, the dog comes to you and you caress the dog. And this is a spontaneous thing. You don't need to teach the dog to seek caresses. Seeks for caresses. We human beings do the same. We have cultures that establish different kinds of distances, but we human beings are sensual animals, and these ancestors of ours must have been sensual animals. Much has been said about the hand as an organ that's necessary for manipulation. But these fellows have a hand very similar to us. They must have had a manipulatory ability as good as ours in relation to pick out the covers of a seed, to separate the seed and eat it. But I think that the hand has another feature, which is of significance and presumably pertains to this history. The hand is an organ that adapts its shape to any surface of the body. In fact, it's an organ of caress. It's a caressing organ, if you wish. Now, the touch of the hand is not trivial. Even chimpanzees appease each other by touching. If there has been a quarrel, they touch each other, and appeasement or peace arises between them. The touch of the hand in us is not trivial. How wonderful to see you here. That touch for us releases a certain physiological dynamics of well-being. Well-being is a physiological dynamics. So these ancestors of ours were sensual, and that means touching, hugging, and through our hand, this particular hand, caressing. You see, look, we extend the fingers. A chimpanzee doesn't extend the fingers that much because it walks on the knuckles. So the hand of the chimpanzee is not as ours, a caressing hand. We have this curious ability to extend the fingers. So I think that all this has to do with sensuality. We are sensual animals now. Our ancestors must have been sensual animals because they were mammals, they were primates, and our present sensuality must have a history. As bipedal animals, sexual encounter entailed, to some extent, a fundamental face-to-face encounter. Well, we treat sometimes animals as if they distinguish themselves less than what they do. But cats know very well each other and distinguish each other, and a lady cat does not copulate with just any cat. They have preferences. So although for us some animals look the same, they are not the same for each other. Maybe they do not use the same criteria that we use for distinction, but they are not the same. But among animals that encounter themselves frontally, the face becomes very important. In fact, in human beings, secondary sexual characters are frontal characters. Not exclusively, but face, breast, shoulders. So the facing with each other is of significance. For us, facing with each other, looking at each other is significant. So in this sensuality and sexuality, this must have been taking place. In other words, what I'm saying is that if one looks at our ancestors, at the remains that there are, there is, for example, some 2 million years ago, some footprints that have been discovered in Africa, which are identical to our footprints. And of course, one can make a reconstruction of the situation in which this took place. And the reconstruction is that these people were walking on soft ash, and then it began to rain, so it became hard, and so you can see the footprints as in sand, soft sand, and then more hard sand. When it is wet, more well-defined footprints, and then they disappear. And there are other footprints of other animals that cross the same area. And what may have happened is that after that, something fell, perhaps volcanic ashes came, and this was preserved. But the people that have studied these footprints claim that they were walking, were two, of slightly different size, so the presumption is a male and a female. It's a presumption. They stopped, turned to look, presumably in the direction of a volcano, and then went forward. But by the footprints, it can be claimed that one of them was carrying at least a baby. This is reconstruction. Of course, we do not know if indeed this was as it took place. But this gives us certain ideas of how these beings lived. So there is a domain through which we can reconstruct the manner of living of these possible ancestors of ours. But as we reconstruct this manner of living, it turns out that it's the same as ours. And we live like that. We are gatherers, we share, we live in most groups, we males participate in child care, we are sensual, we look at each other and encounter sexually frontally. Caresses are important. Which is the difference? language. Can we claim language here? Strictly we cannot. But we know that something must be added here to have human manner of living, which is language. If language is a flowing, a domain, a manner of living in consensual coordinations of behavior, for this to arise requires some intimate living together. Occasional being together and separation does not allow for enough intimacy so that coordinations of actions are not mere occasional coordinations of actions. Occasional doings do not constitute a manner of living. The manner of living is constituted by that configuration of operations, of characteristics, of development, and so on and so forth, that define the identity of the lineage, that are conserved generation after generation. If they are not conserved generation after generation, they do not constitute a lineage. If they do not constitute a lineage, you don't have the consequences of lineages. So occasional coordinations of consensual behavior is not enough. Does the brain of the dog have the complexity such that coordinations of behavior may arise? Yes. I have told you of my own little history with my dog, and each one of you may have more histories to tell in relation to this. But we differ from the dog, even when we enter with the dog in some consensual coordination of actions or of behavior, in that we live immersed in it. This is part of our manner of living. So the question is, in what moment in this history languaging arose and became part of the manner of living? But these fellows were, like all mammals, emotioning. I claim that in some moment in this history, this intimate manner of living opened the possibility for this occasional manner of living, occasional doing coordinations of consensual behavior became learned in the family. And as it became learned in the family, the children learned to do this, and as the children learned to do this and grew doing this, their children learned to do this, and a lineage was established. Notice, if what defines a lineage is the conservation of a manner of living, is an ontogenic phenotype, that which defines the lineage is not genetically determined necessarily, does not depend on a particular genetics, requires the genetics or the initial constitution which allows that to happen. But we have not to think in terms of genetic determination as we are being pushed to think by many modern geneticist thinkers. All that is necessary for the lineage to establish is that that manner of living, which may be learned, which indeed is learned in this particular case, is learned by the children, generation after generation, and then you have a lineage in which that manner of living is conserved, and the lineage is defined by the conservation of that manner of living. So what I claim is that these conditions this manner of living constituted a domain in which languaging could arise and be established as part of the manner of living. And when that happened, a new lineage arose, which is our lineage, language. But something happened here, that languaging arose, of course, as part of a manner of living of beings which were emotioning, which were already coordinating also their behavior in emotions. With domestic animals, we mostly coordinate our behavior in emotions. We ourselves coordinate our behavior in emotional coordinations, which are consensual coordinations too. When this happens, then necessarily or unavoidably, languaging and emotioning braid together in daily life as a manner of living. I call this braiding together of languaging and emotioning conversation. Conversation means, from its Latin origin, turning together. It's almost dancing together. So as languaging arose in a background of emotioning braided with languaging, so that as we language, our emotions flow, and as our emotions flow, our languaging flows too. And we know that we change each other's emotional flow through language. And as our emotional flow changes, our language changes too. I call that braiding of languaging and emotioning conversation. So I claim that human lineage arose when conversation became to be conserved as part of the manner of living that defined that lineage. We human beings exist in conversations, in networks of languaging and emotioning braided with each other, in networks of consensual coordinations of behavior braided with emotioning. Under circumstances where the emotion defines the action that the behavior is. When may have happened this? My claim is that this could not have happened later than about 3 million years ago. Now, it did not happen boom with the gigantic explosion, but that conversation was part of the manner of living, conserved generation after generation. Systems are constitutively conservative. Now, this is a gigantic claim. All systems are conservative. They are constitutively conservative because when they do not conserve their organization, they disintegrate. So it's part of the condition of existence to be conservative. And systems last longer or shorter according to whether in the dynamic of interactions with the medium in which they are realized, the organization and congruence with the medium is conserved or not. Manners of living are conservative. They are not easy to change. You go abroad and you continue being Australian, whatever to be Australian is. I would claim that to be an Australian is that you go on being even when you are abroad. Which means that you remain immersed in a network of conversation which is apparent in how you reflect, how do you give your opinions, what preferences you have for doing this or for doing that, how you move in living. What do you say to yourself under different circumstances? In what moments you laugh? In what moments you cry? How you go to help somebody else when the person appears to you in need? I remember when I was a student in England that somebody trying to show to me the English character told me this anecdote of this gentleman that is coming out of the house and sees that the little girl of the neighbors is on the roof, and he thinks that it's going to fall down off the roof. So he, after thinking, goes, knocks the door and says, "Madam, forgive me for intruding in your private life, but your little girl is on the roof and may fall down." In Chile, you would not feel that you're intruding in the private life of the other if you tell that at all. You either would go immediately to rescue the little girl or shout to the mother, "Yeah, madam, look, please," and then you enter immediately into interaction with the little girl to do something. But it never would occur to you that you are intruding in the private life of this family. But I was told this as an expression of the British phlegma. You are never moved beyond what is legitimate at any moment. I do not know, of course, if this is an adequate rendering of it. You know that much better than I. But those are the kind of differences because they constitute different conversation. To intrude in the private life of somebody else is a conversation which appears in the coordinations of consensual behavior and emotions involved. You think, oh, if I go into this house, I'm going to intrude in the private life. I shouldn't go. Yet I must do something. I mean, that little girl is going to fall. And then you enter into a whole discourse that follows a particular form. It's a conversation which you realize alone, but pertains to a manner of living in the community to which you belong. In fact, I'm going to say that different cultures are defined as different networks of conversations. So what I'm claiming, that human beings, the human lineage, began some 3 million years ago, when conversations began to be part of the manner of living conserved, that these 3 million years is an adequate time, I think, because the transformation of the nervous system, the transformations of the larynx, the transformation of the face entailed in this time. Because this languaging in this must have involved, of course, the whole bodyhood. But particularly, we belong to a lineage in which it involves sound production. So sound production must have been part of it at the very beginning. It's not that it was first gestures and then sound. No, you don't have a transformation of that kind. It must have begun immediately, as it is now, in which, of course, the body also participates. In languaging, we are not only sound producing, although now we can speak by phone. But I imagine that in those days they could not speak by phone. Well, not only there were no phones, but because the whole bodyhood was perhaps much more involved in the beginning of this. As when I said to my dog, "Lobo." But could not have been much later than that, yes?
If you say that all these things that you say are conserved, where did they begin from? What happened before that 3.5 million years ago?
Before languaging began to be conserved, braided with emotioning, languaging must have been an occasional phenomenon, as with my dog. So all these things, all the variations in the change of lineage, which begin to be conserved, defining a new lineage, appear as circumstantial variations in the previous one. And if that means that, of course, there are variations here in the initial constitution, yes, there are variations here in the initial constitution that allow also for a variability in the individual histories. Strictly speaking, I claim that the genetics follows the ontogenic phenotype. The genetic constitution follows the ontogenic phenotype in evolution. Yes?
Is it too early to introduce the notion of morals into behaviour? Emotioning is one thing, languaging is another, but we can get to some very strange morals. It seems to me as though we know quite well, possibly quite non-language.
Well, I would say that morals arises when language is sufficiently expanded and enriched so that you can make reflection about your being in language. A moral is a distinction of how you are in your manner of being in comparison with something else.
Take the case of the scientist who produces goods on the one hand which destroys the environment on the other. It's an issue of moral, isn't it?
Well, it is both an issue of moral and of ethics. But that requires that you make a particular reflection. If you have been brought as a scientist in the understanding that science has value in itself, that it is not your responsibility the consequences of your discoveries or your inventions, then you will never make the reflection unless something special happens. Let us suppose that you invent something, or you are doing some research and you are claiming that you are performing some discoveries of how the world is in reality, and then you are a benefactor of the progress of humanity. And one of the things that you are doing suddenly kills one of your children. And then you say, my goodness, what I'm doing. If it kills the children of the other country beyond, you don't see it. We never see beyond our nose. I was in England a student in 1955 when there was an exhibition of some paintings about Hiroshima. And I, with other Chilean friends, went to see this painting, which were depicting, of course, what happened in Hiroshima with the atomic bomb. Obviously, you see, I was conservative. I was going with Chileans to see this. And as we came out, one of my friends said, and what do I care if 100,000 Japanese died in Hiroshima if I had met no one of them? So my hair stood on end when I heard this, and then I said, thank you very much, because he allowed me to have an insight. He was right. How can you care if you don't see, if you have no relation with this person, no imagination to have a relation with this person? You don't care. So morals and ethics, which are not the same, have to do with your ability to reflect and to consider the consequences of your actions in a domain of concerns which has to do with the community to which you belong. Prior to that, if you don't have the space or the abilities or whatever is required for making reflection, no morals. So in some moment in this history, when the living in a network of conversation was sufficiently complex, and when some breaks took which allow for a reflection on the manner of living, morals arose. So when people say, oh, human beings are moral animals, this is a very special thing. This doesn't have to do strictly with the biology, it has to do with the languaging. Okay, but for this history to take place, such that this manner of living may take place, intimacy of living together must take place. Recurrent interactions must take place. Interactions that result in separation do not allow for that. But no human doing takes place outside emotioning. So there must have been some fundamental emotioning in this history. And my claim is that the fundamental emotion in the history of humanity is love. Love, I underline it, but I don't write it with capital letters. It's just ordinary, trivial, simple, daily acceptance of the other as a legitimate other in coexistence with yourself. Love. The fundamental emotion in the history of constitution of humanity cannot have been aggression. Aggression leads to separation. Cannot have been aggression, must have been love. Now, are there features in us that show that this is so? Yes. We are animals dependent on love. A touch which appease is not a touch which offends. The emotion is completely different. Which is the emotion? Love. It's the domain of actions, of those actions that constitute the other as a legitimate other in coexistence with oneself. We are animals constitutively dependent on love, not culturally. Love is not a cultural phenomenon, it's a biological phenomenon. And we are so much so dependent on love that whenever love is interfered with in our life, we get ill. We catch a cold, we catch an intestinal infection, we break our legs, cancer arises. Now, what do you mean by love and catching a cold? Which is the relation? Well, there are many ways in which the relation can be shown. Some of them, for example, could have to do with the immune system, but there are much more direct relations in the case of the cold, for example, which can be shown due to the speed with which this happens. For bacteria or for viruses, to produce an infection, they must attach on the cell surface. If they do not attach on the cell surface, they do not penetrate the cell in case of the viruses, not reproduce and produce an infection in the case of bacteria. So if this is the cell surface, the virus must attach and has certain elements for attachment. Or the bacteria are some of the pili of the filaments of attachment of the bacteria must reach the cell surface. And this attachment, of course, is not just anywhere. There are features of the membrane where the attachment can take place. Why does not all the time take place? Because the cells, the surfaces of the human body or the animal body are continuously being washed by secretions. The skin by continuous shedding off cells, continuously. So this is a continuous washing of our skin. The surfaces of the mouth of the respiratory system are continuously being washed by secretions. Continuously. And which secretion? It was a very interesting secretion, a mucous secretion that these little fellows get caught in it and thrown away. Thrown away, thrown away. So these bacteria are around us, these viruses are around us, and they're carried and eliminated. Yet, if you have some difficulty in the domain of love, or some other distressing emotion, which always have to do with the domain of relations, secretions alter. Cell surface become exposed, bacteria, viruses attach, and you get a disease.
Illness is structure determined, in other words.
Oh yes. But notice the dynamics. This is this interesting point. The dynamic has to do with your well-being in relations. If the well-being in relations is altered, then your secretions are altered, then you get an infection and you have a dysentery, or you have, depending on where, how do you react to this? And in addition to this, other things happen in the whole systemic reaction of the organism with the immune system, with the hormones, and the whole thing is a system which shifts in one way or in another way according to how are you flowing in your conversations. And the fundamental emotion in coexistence is love. Anger is not trivial. Love is not trivial. Falling in love is not trivial either. But now, I say this is the triangle you wanted to see, Paula, the other day. I said that if I put here the dimensions, love, and these are the dimensions, I will make a curve like this. Here is what acceptance of the other in the street. You make space for the other going by you. And here is when you fall in love. You want all possible dimensions of coexistence in mutual acceptance when you fall in love. Here is friendship. It's almost like falling in love. It's not all possible dimensions, but you're close, and sometimes you move from one to the other, and this of course is movable. This is the dimensionality of it. But love is fundamental in human existence. And not only that, most human suffering is cured through love. That which you mostly do in therapy is loving. When I was a medical student, and I mentioned this, and you who are physicians or who work in medical profession know this very well, of course, but it impressed me when I was a medical student in 1950, 51, that the professor of medicine, as we were beginning, told us the physician begins to act when he or she accepts the call. You say, yes, I'm going. The patient begins to get better. And I said, what is he telling? What is he telling this man? Obviously, this is not fantasy. He's a professor of medicine. He's not speaking about magic, how one would understand magic as something completely alien from the scientific world. What is he telling? It took me years to understand that what he was speaking of was love. That in the moment in which you accept the call, you say, I am going. What you have done is to accept the legitimacy of the calling of the patient. The patient is recognized as such, and the biology of love begins to operate. You recover trust, your physiology changes. Yes?
Right, but we often in the Anglo-Saxon world call it love and call it the placebo effect.
Yeah, because we do not understand what we are doing. Because we belong in this moment to a culture who is centered in conversations, scientific conversations, on the actions on an external reality, and we think that only drugs have action, and one would say, a scientist speaking about love, what is that? People think that I have gone crazy. I'm not anymore a scientist because I speak about love. And by claiming that love is not part of science, then of course it's never considered and reflected upon. by scientists. But love is the universal placebo effect, which is better than any medicine. Yes?
I think it was Dostoevsky who said that love in action is a terrible thing.
Love?
Love
In action, yeah. You cannot avoid it.
Well, it's well known that small children who are not touched become very ill and some of them die.
Yes, thank you. So all that is part of our manner of living. Now, different cultures as different network of conversations constitute then different manners of living which permit touching, restrict touching, encourage touching, deny love, value love. As they deny love, they invent placebos so as to have the effects. Different cultures.
So some cultures are better than others?
No, I would say that the betterness is a reflection that you make here, according to your preferences.
Well, in terms of mutual acceptance with the criteria of love as the most important.
Yeah, but this is because you like that. But if you are a member of a culture and you live... I saw the other day, here in television, whenever I go somewhere, I look at the television because it shows the country, or at least some of the conversations that constitute the country. And I saw a particular reportage, how do you say, in a program, in relation to a man in South Africa. Because there was a litigation, because this man had killed a black laborer. And the journalist was speaking with him and was speaking with a lawyer that was defending the family of this man that had been killed. And the owner of the farm in which this black worker had been killed by the owner of the farm was a young man. And he was saying, well, I treat my workers as I learned to treat them. My father treats them as I treat them. And they accept this manner of treatment. And he was speaking in perfect comfort of something that you would consider completely inadequate. And the laborers, these black laborers, were living in this relationship also in a fundamentally, perfectly acceptable congruence and comfort. It required a lawyer, a black lawyer from somewhere else, to claim that this was a crime. A slave is a slave only when reflects upon his or her slavery. Now, this I think is a very important thing because we are the kind of animals that in our ontogeny, in our individual history, we grow in congruence with our circumstances. And if we do not reflect upon our circumstances, we never say this is good or this is bad. We live with it. Every political activist knows that the main, most fundamental action of political activism is to create class consciousness. Why do you have to create class consciousness? Because unless you reflect about your relations in a class domain, you don't see yourself member of a class, you don't see yourself exploited or abused or whatever it is. So if you say this is better than that, it's your choice. And you will act according to it. I'm not saying that I would not agree with you, but it's an act of responsibility of the person that claims. It's an act in the responsibility of the person that claims this is better than that. Because this person specifies the condition of betterness.
Well, if you specify that, yeah, it would have to be within the domain of assuming that love was a fundamental emotion which was necessary for social relationships.
Yeah, but we don't only live in social relations.
Well, if we talk about,
not all human relations are social relations. From what I have just said, not all human relations are social relations. Work relations are not founded on love. Work relations are not social relations. Hierarchical relations are not social relations. An army is not a social system. Yet, the general and its assistant could constitute a social system. Just a second. Excuse me, what I'm saying is that if indeed we take seriously what I say in terms of emotions, and that emotions define the actions, in the moment in which I say love is the fundamental emotion in the constitution of social phenomena, I open space for the question, what other phenomena do other emotions constitute? I already said that aggression destroys social coexistence. Work systems are not social systems. And precisely because they are not social systems, that you require laws in the community in which work takes place so that some elements of social relations are recovered. Because work relations are relations of commitment for the fulfillment of a task in which your condition of a human being is irrelevant. All that is important is the fulfillment of the task and the fulfillment of the agreement established in the work agreement. That you may get ill, that you may have a wife, children, a grandmother that dies, or whatever it is irrelevant. But that is not irrelevant in a social system. Much of our problems arise from not understanding that different emotions constitute the fundament for different kinds of human relations. Australia is not a society. It's a country as a conglomerate of social systems and non-social systems. And these interwove with each other. And they are not fixed, they are fluid. You belong to a social system, sometimes you stop belonging to it, you belong to a work system, it begins as a work system, becomes a social system, it begins as a social system, becomes a work system, and so on and so forth. It's a fluid thing. So whenever you say, this is better than that, either you are claiming that you know the truth, that you know how reality is, and you are in objectivity without parentheses, or you are making a statement of preference. I myself prefer, of course, to live in a social system than in a work system. This is why I said the other day I never work. Yes?
You used to talk about stickiness with love. Do you still do that?
No, because when I talk about stickiness, I did not fully understand emotions. So I realized that there was this special phenomenon of this position for being with the other, in which you accept the other. This is what I was meaning by stickiness, but I was not very clear. Now, in fact, stickiness is there because when you accept the other, you stick with the other, you remain in recurrent interactions with the other. So that was my initial steps in this. But I'm not denying it, but I'm saying I have expanded in that. Yes?
Because love has so many complex associations, could you substitute for acceptance? Because after all, acceptance really is the fundamental.
No. I do not want to, because in daily life we use love precisely in those terms. Whenever you have concern, accept the other and have concern for the other, which could be a person, an animal, a thing. If you clean your car all weekend, they say, you love your car, don't you? If you take care of the animal, you say you love the animals. Or you have a great love for nature because you are not going cutting trees or destroying flowers or killing animals. Love in daily life means precisely that. Entering in a domain of actions that constitute the other as a legitimate other in coexistence with yourself.
Acceptance plus concern.
No, the concern arises in acceptance, yes. If there is acceptance, there is concern. But it's a domain of actions. Now, at the same time, of course, people would like to have other words, solidarity, or whatever it is, because love is a very powerful word. I mean, Dostoevsky, as you mentioned it, is a very powerful word because it's so fundamental in our lives. But at the same time, in our attempt or desire to be objective, to be rational, to be universal through something that is independent from us, since love has to do with an emotion, and hence we can be in it or out of it, people want to force the other in other way, which does not require the agreement of the other. So say, no, love, no, this is not scientific to speak about love, not scientific to speak about emotions. You have to have reality as the reference for universal truth. Yes? Oh, yes. And then you. Please.
I noticed that there was a shift in the conversation about work happening, where there's beginning to be an emphasis on people. And I'm wondering, with your fellow countryman, Flores, is speaking about caring as part of managing.
Yeah. I think you are right that this has changed. You see, because when we speak about the origin of our patriarchal culture, we shall see how come that this concern arises even in work. But you are right, it's changing. But at the same time, it's changing in a very special manner. But I would like to come to that later on. Please, if I don't, you ask me again. Yes?
Just in reference to the comment about stickiness, it seems to me that hatred is more sticky than love.
Well, it is sticky. I don't know whether it's more sticky than love. It's also sticky. But it's a domain of actions in which the actions are the destruction of a particular other. Now, there is passion, which is intensity. To fall in love is not mere passion. It's that you want all dimensions of coexistence with the other to be acceptable to each other. Passion has to do with intensity. So you can have great passion in love, in hate, in aggression, in fear. Okay, so what I'm saying is that we are the present of a history of conservation of a lineage defined by a manner of living that entail these characteristics in this kind of animals that we are, bipedal primates, in which conversation is a fundamental, not a fundamental, is part of the manner of living. In such a way that nowadays we are immersed in conversations. Now, before we break for a coffee, I shall say something that happened to me in Chile in relation to abortion. My wife doesn't like that I speak about abortion, but since she's not here now, I shall not enter into disagreement with her. There was shortly ago, about 2 months ago, published a book on induced abortion in Chile. And this book shows, or this study shows, that in Chile, in a population of about 12 million, there is of the order of 200,000 induced abortions a year. One can make the computation by the calls in the hospitals, in the clinics where you have to treat an induced abortion. That means that the number of actual induced abortion must be greater than that, because those are those which come to the notice of the people. And they asked me to make a comment in the presentation of this book. And this book contains several articles by physicians, lawyers, economists, anthropologists. The economist spoke about the expenses that generate induced abortion for the treatment that is required. The anthropologist, a woman, wrote a very beautiful and interesting article in which she showed that there were orally transmitted notions about birth control among the women which were mistaken. For example, it was a very widespread notion that the moment of greatest infertility was between menstruations, precisely the contrary. Well, on the one hand, that is very interesting because it shows that women are concerned with procreation and with the possibilities of interfering with it. If there is an oral tradition about how to interfere or to impede or to avoid pregnancy, even if it is mistaken, it means that the concern is there. It fails because it's inadequate, but the concern is there. So I reflected upon all these various concerns that appear in this book. And then I said that I wanted to say something about what constituted to be human. And from what I have said, you may already imagine that I say or I think that to be human is not a biological condition, but is a cultural one. That we are not conceived humans when a zygote is formed. We are conceived Homo sapiens, the zoological species, but we are not conceived human. That we become human in the process of being involved in a network of conversations that constitute us as human beings. Now, when does that happen? Now, this resembles a little bit to the old discussion in Christianity and perhaps in some other religions as well, I do not know, about in what moment the soul enters the embryo or the fetus. Because if the soul enters the fetus in the last month of pregnancy, only if the baby dies before birth in the last month of pregnancy, this baby deserves the rights proper to a dead human being. If the fetus dies in the 6th month, then of course not, because it was not a human being, the soul was not there. This is in the discussion that took place in Catholic, I suppose in general Christian tradition, I do not know. But I said that becoming human is not a question of development, of embryological development. There is not a moment in the embryological development in which humanness arises. I said that in the moment in which the mother, the woman, stops looking at her pregnancy as a disease, as a hindrance, and begins to treat the embryo or the baby or the fetus as another being, so she becomes double. And in her reflections, a name and a destiny appear, a future appear, then that being begins the path of humanization. Prior to that, an abortion results in the loss of a living being, but not in a human being. After that, an abortion results in the loss of a child. Now, I mention this because I wanted to say this in relation to this history. Now, the fact that we are human as cultural entities does not mean that our being cultural entities has no consequences in the evolutionary history. Because it's the manner of living that defines the history. It's the ontogenic phenotype that defines the history. And as this ontogenic phenotype, this manner of living is conserved generation after generation, genetics variation will follow it, and the whole structure will change according to that, such that eventually we have a genetics that has to do with the conditions that make this particular manner of living so easy as it is in us, that we become human so easily. So the manner of living is not even trivial in the long run genetically. It's not determined genetically, but it's not trivial for the genetic history of a particular kind of being. Because the genetics follow, is carried, so to speak, by the conservation of the ontogenic phenotype that is conserved. Notice that as the ontogenic phenotype conserves includes all these that I have listed here, plus conversations, this conversation can enrich, can be transformed. And in the process of being transformed, our genetic constitution has changed in such a way that our bodyhood has changed in such a way that now we have a nervous system of a being that can learn all this tremendous complexity of languaging in 2 years. But at the same time, this leads us to realize that due to the nature of this phenomenon that languaging is, and of this living in conversation that human living is, which entails consensus of consensus, these coordinations of consensual coordinations of consensual coordinations of behavior, the kind of brain that is needed for us for that is such that the abilities for consensuality that we have are gigantic by being languaging animals, and are the same, fundamentally the same, in all human beings. There is no ground, biologically speaking, to claim that there are fundamental differences in abilities for consensuality in different kinds of human beings. I have an article that I wrote with a young colleague, which we call the intelligence of intelligence, in which we claim that intelligence has to do with consensuality, not with solving with problem solving, with consensuality. As you enter in a particular domain of consensus, within the operation of that domain of consensus, what you do there can be seen as problem solving. But what constitutes intelligence is the ability to participate with others in different domains of consensual behavior. So this understanding, I think, to me at least, shows, on the one hand, that the fundamental intelligence of human beings is equally widespread, and of course you always have extremes of distribution which have to do with variations in the anatomy and the physiology of the nervous system, in which you have these extremes. But the tremendous, the normal thing, all of us here are people of normal intelligence. I will say that 99.9% of humanity is of normal intelligence. But this also means that whatever a human being can do, another human being can also do. You have not been exposed to a situation like I was exposed in Chile. But if you are exposed to a situation, for example, in which there is violation of human rights, as we call it now, torture and things of this kind, we must realize that whatever a human being can do, another human being can do too. I know I am as equally capable of being a torturer as any other human being. I think that my only possibility of not ever becoming a torturer is being aware that I'm equally capable as any other human being. But at the same time, I'm equally capable of whatever beauties of understanding and poetry any other human being may have. But the difference, fundamentally, in different human beings is in the emotioning, in the preferences, in what one enjoys. Yes?
I just missed your comment on intelligence. What constitutes intelligence?
I think that intelligence is the ability to participate in consensual domains with somebody else, or with the world in which one lives in the process of bringing it forth. And this, for being a languaging being, what is required for being a languaging being is such a magnitude of ability for consensuality that I claim that we can expect that the 99.9% of human beings are equivalent in intelligence, may not be equivalent in preferences, in what constitutes their joy, certainly not in what network of conversation they have been involved, and how they have their emotioning has been enhanced in one way or another. But in this constitutive ability for languaging, I think that we are essentially the same. Yes?
It's not really connected, but you've used the word knowing a lot. You haven't used the word thinking at all. I'm not sure if you've
I have not used the word thinking, yeah. Well, because if you are working, you don't really talk about working, do you? Unless you want to talk about working when you are working.
Reflect upon. I want you to reflect upon this thinking.
Yeah. But I shall do this after the coffee break. Thank you. Moment for questions. Please.
Humberto, when we're talking before about the unborn child becoming human with the interrelationship, with the interaction with its mother, is this the only person who's able to have any relationship at all with an unborn child?
No. No. In fact, motherhood is an operation. It could be a man or a woman. What happens is that pregnancy is the privilege of women. So what happens in pregnancy, women do not directly participate, although we participate as friends of the mother.
But not directly in relationship to the child.
Well, through the motherhood. As we interact with the mother, and through the body of the mother we interact with the baby.
So the father can have no relationship with the child except with the mother?
Or through the bodyhood of the mother, yeah. With the conversation with the mother. For example, a father or a man, this woman lives with this man. Now, a father, I think, is a patriarchal entity. I don't like to speak about the father. But the man that lives with the woman and that has this peculiar relation with the child interact with the woman in relation to the child, with joy or not with joy. Oh, you are pregnant again. This you are pregnant again is an interaction with the child through the mother. It is not trivial for this being that is growing that this man that lives with the woman says, you are pregnant again, or how beautiful, we are going to have another child. It's not the same. Now, we do not know exactly how it's not the same, though. Because we assume that the uterus has a barrier that protects against many molecules and so on and so forth, but in fact we do not know how much this is indeed the case. Just a second. My contention is that this is more important than what it seems, and by importance I mean is more present than what it seems, this modulation or influence on the development of the embryo and the fetus through what happens with the mother, and hence with the interactions in which the mother is. And at the same time, most of the time, this does not interfere with the development of the Homo sapiens body, but has consequences in the development of the human being. For example, it has been shown by a Frenchman, Tomatis, who has been interested in hearing. He has shown that a child born to a woman that lives in a particular language, Spanish for example, and after birth is brought up, let's say, in English, still has an ear for the spectrum of sounds of Spanish that acquire by living in this particular Spanish-speaking environment. So, but this is a minute thing. No, it's a gigantic thing because hearing is so important in the development of the nervous system, so it's not so minute. Yet we do not know because we have not, you see, if we do not look, we do not see. Whatever we distinguish, we bring forth. So we do not perform the operations of distinction, it doesn't appear. And for performing an operation of distinction, either this must happen and we see it, or we must conceive it and do it. But you wanted to say something more.
I was also thinking of, for a mother who doesn't want to have any interaction with the fetus, is there, that denies anybody else into
That is indeed the case, and sometimes does not, because sometimes a mother can be forced to have a child even if she does not want to, and this environment has consequences in this. But a moment comes in this development in which, of course, unless there is a very gross interference, this child is anyhow swept into humanity because it's coming out and there it is, and things happen with this child. Now, sometimes the denial of the child is of such a magnitude that maybe autism arises. Maybe this begins already in the fetus. Maybe we do not, just a second, you and then him. We do not know very much how to look at the denials that we perform of the other. We are not accustomed to look at the things that we do as acceptance or denial. We do not realize how we can have a child in our arms without having the child in our arms. I remember to have one of my children in my arms and doing something so that he would do this to me. Father, you are with me. I mean, for me this was a shock. I was the child and suddenly I realized that I was not. So to have the child in your arms does not necessarily constitute being in acceptance of the child. So that is something that has to be learned. I have been working in this work on that we call patriarchal and matristic conversations with a German doctor, Dr. Verden-Soller. She's a woman that has been interested and has been studying the normal mother-child relationship development in relation to the development of body awareness, self and social consciousness. And it turns out that she has shown that there are many features of our culture that interfere with this relation of mutual acceptance of the child and the mother, even though the declarations that they are not being interfered with. One speaks as if this were not the case, but we do not perform the actions. We speak about sentiment and we do not perform the actions. For example, there is no body contact in play. And the mothers do not know how to do this because the culture has thrown them away from that possibility. So there is a whole space of research, if you wish, of looking of possibilities of awareness and understanding something that must be taking place if we bring force structure, determined system, and so on and so forth, but we do not know how to look at it. You?
My question was really related to the answer that you gave to the lady behind me. But in terms of the developing the child becoming human, isn't there the life of that child in the emotionally, languaging, and reflection of the father?
Well, no, it's perfectly okay. Yes, but you see, these values, of course, to the extent that the father, this man, participates with the woman, yes, he's a participant of this. But if he doesn't, it's not a participant. It's not necessary. Let me put it in this way. Women come with children, and we men, if we love the woman, we love the children. But we are not necessary. If we are not there, it doesn't matter. If we are there, it matters tremendously. It matters tremendously because we are part of this domain of interactions. And of course, that's what I'm saying, but through the mother. How does the man interact with his fetus? Through sound, through the body of the mother, through touching the mother, through saying things to the mother. So creating a space in which the mother is, or modifying the space in the emotional dynamics or in the object dynamics. He himself? Yeah. Of course the father. The child exists. For the father may exist or not.
Yeah, may exist or not.
Yeah.
But may exist.
But this I do not deny. But what I was not speaking about what was happening to the man, I was speaking what was happening to the baby. For example, my first child was born in London, 1955. And of course, I was concerned about the child and so on and so forth. But when my wife went to the hospital, I wanted to stay there and participate, see, I was not allowed. And then I said, I shall stay anyhow and wait until the birth takes place. So I waited, and after a while, a nurse comes and says, you had a little boy. How is the mother? You had a little boy. How is the mother? I was not concerned at all about the little boy. I went home, I was not allowed to see her, and I met a friend who said to me, how wonderful to be a father. And he was speaking to me as something that has no relevance to me. How wonderful to be a father. Oh, you are a father. And then I was thinking, I said, okay, and I wrote a letter to a friend in Chile saying that I was indeed in this curious situation in which a boy had been born, which was my responsibility to create or contribute to create a space in which he would grow as a self-respecting and socially aware human being. That this letter is somewhere in the collections of letters of this friend. Next day I come, I see my wife, I see how she is, then they bring the baby, I look at the baby, and then, wow, there is the baby. There was the baby, and then a relationship began, which was completely different from whatever was before when the baby was inside my wife. So we must admit this dynamics. Nothing of this is only one way. This man may not be interested in the baby at all, and suddenly the baby is there, and everything changes. Or may be interested in the baby, then the baby is a girl. Or the reverse, you see, depends on what the expectation or desires are. So it is not one thing. Life is never in one way, as we are led to believe by our habit of being inobjective, in the explanatory path of objectivity without parentheses. Fatherhood, motherhood, no. It's fluid. And we generate conversations that stabilize one manner of living or another. Now this is why it's so important what I said. Remember, I said systems are conservative. As soon as a system arises a history of conservation. This, I see the baby, and a system arises, which is baby and me. You could put the name of father, whatever it is. If I put the name of father, and I have the conversations of fatherhood, of course this is a baby with a father. But if I put another name, I say, oh, this baby is in my charge, but I don't speak about fatherhood, then the system that arises there is one of a different kind than fatherhood. So it could belong to another culture in which fathers do not exist, but exist these men that live with these women and establish this beautiful relationship with the children. They are not fathers. Why not? Because they do not belong to the conversations in which father is a particular manner of being, a particular network of conversations. But once that begins, it goes or breaks down. But normally, the dynamics is one dynamic of conservation of the system. You enter into, for example, I say, I wrote this letter to my friend. This child has been born, and it is my responsibility to participate in the creation of the conditions in which this child can grow as a self-respecting and socially conscious human being. Then I see this child, I like it, I establish some relationship, and I go on thinking this, so this is the fellow of whom I am responsible, Charming fellow. And this system is conserved. The whole dynamic of the constitution of the system is conservative of the system. And this is the usual thing with systems. Systems constitute the dynamics of conservation of them. Sometimes not. Sometimes they break down. I have been a member of a club only once in my life. It was a funny club. It was a club for, and it was constituted as the anarchist club. We got together, we that consider ourselves anarchists, to create the anarchist club. We got together once and never more. Yeah. The very definition of the anarchist club does not constitute the dynamic of its conservation. So it didn't last. Just a moment.
Just to carry the abortion thing one bit further, there's been a series of papers which arriving in International Journal of Psychoanalysis from an Italian female psychoanalyst called Piantelli. And she's been observing babies in utero using ultrasound technology, and having various people view the baby, other observers at stages of the gestation. And the interesting thing that's coming out of those studies is the behaviour of the baby in utero has correspondences even at the age of 2.
To what?
2 years after the sort of behaviour. There's one good little girl who's described as being very much stuck in a corner of the womb for most of the time, and as a 2-year-old she's still manifesting that behaviour. They also got people who are observing...
A behaviour associated with what? You missed that.
Well, just that was where she spent most of the time, was sort of snuggled in. The observers would describe her as sort of snuggled into a corner of the room.
I see, yeah.
And the people were still describing her in some of those ways at 2. As it turned out, independent observers of the mother also described the mother in that same way. So that there are several other children described, and twins also described in these studies. But the connection between the descriptions of the observers of both of the parents, and the fathers were included as well, had a correspondence with behaviour in the womb, which were then correspondences in life. So we have the structured determinism of descriptions of parents seemingly affecting the in utero behaviour, which is then manifested in life again.
Yeah, but thank you very much. Yes, because let us say that there is pregnancy and there is a conversation for abortion. And this conversation for abortion doesn't pass. Now, the baby is going on, the pregnancy is going on, and yet the conversation for abortion is the conversation of denial of the child. Now, it could be a passing conversation. We say, oh, we cannot have this child, what shall we do? And eventually, you have the child and this conversation for abortion disappears. You say, well, okay, we are going to have a child. So you jump from one conversation to the other. But the conversation could be, oh, again we have this problem of the child. We should make an abortion. We try, we cannot. We have to live with this problem. And you conserve a conversation of rejection of the child, which goes beyond the moment in which the possibility for abortion took place. And then, of course, that goes on at birth and after birth, and the conversations of the parents and the conversation of what the child is being told and so on and so forth constitute a conservation of the denial.
You guessed it. The story was the little girl was concerned. The mother didn't want to have the baby. There was a long debate about that during the gestation period.
Yeah. You see, in a way one would say a baby that is not wanted is better than that is not born for these kind of things. Now, this is a reflection. I mean, I'm not inviting a particular kind of behavior because I recommend nothing. I don't even recommend love. But you cannot escape it. But yes, one enters in different conversations, and these conversations constitute systems that stabilize certain dynamics in which the bodyhood and the circumstance change, the structure of the system and the circumstance change congruently in the conservation of the system that is defined through the conversations in which these human beings participate. Now, so conversations, remember, braiding of languaging and emotioning. Conversation of not wanting a child, which does not stop, carries on indefinitely, even up to adulthood. And sometimes the mothers or the fathers tell the child many years later that they had not wanted him or her. So the conversation went on all the time. Because if the conversation stopped, it never appears that you did not want this child. And you may remember, perhaps in the intimacy of the conversation of the couple, that a moment was in which they did not want it, but they are now very happy with it. So the conversation never appears in relation to the child. Conversations as dynamics of coordinations of emotioning and actions constitute systems that stabilize manners of living, in which the structure of the participants and the circumstance change congruently. And we do not know much how to look to the physiological or structural changes, although we can recognize that they have taken place, as in the case that you have just mentioned, or other cases. You wanted still to make one? No?
We're talking really about emotioning when we're talking about abortion. We said yesterday, I think, that emotioning causes disposition to action. I think we also agree that it can cause, say, the flow of adrenaline. So emotion causes chemical changes in the mother.
Yes.
Which must have an effect on...
Exactly. This is why I said that since we speak about the blood barrier in the placenta and so on and so forth. We tend not to see this. Yet we do not know, because if we begin to look, we shall find out. But there are also other things. For example, changes in tension of the uterus, the changes in tension of the muscles of the abdomen, changes in the dynamics of the digestive system of the mother. To what extent this has consequences in the environment in which the baby is, when it is in the environment of sounds, of pressures, and so on and so forth. We do not know. You wanted to make a question?
Yes, unfortunately I can't formulate my question very well, but I guess as much as anything, it's on the process of reflection. This whole weekend is an invitation to reflection, and we're talking a lot about reflection. It seems like it's a pretty fundamental part of human functioning. And I'm just wondering if you've got any comments to make on how fundamental, is it part of, is it unique to human? Do you view it as unique to human?
Very good. Well, I will say that reflection can only take place as there is languaging. You see, because for reflection you need to perform a very peculiar operation. You need to treat your circumstance as something independent from you and contemplate it. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? I'm not saying that you have to enter into the path of objectivity without parentheses. You must make this operation of treating your circumstance, whichever way you distinguish it, and contemplate it. To do that, languaging is necessary. Because languaging, as coordination of consensual coordinations of behavior, I could describe them also consensual coordination, consensual distinctions of consensual distinctions. You distinguish yourself, and then you distinguish your distinction of yourself and contemplate it. For that, you need to be in language. So, not languaging beings cannot reflect. Now, it does not mean that they do not have body awareness, for example. If you have a little cat, you touch the tail, the cat moves the tail. Next time you approach the tail, the cat moves the tail before you touch it. So there is an operational body awareness. But an operational body awareness is not the same as a reflective body awareness. This does not mean that the cat says, this fellow wants to touch my tail again, I shall not let it move the tail. No, it's not that. For doing that, you require this operation, because otherwise these systems are closed on themselves, as the song said this morning. The song said very clearly, we are closed in our closeness, unless we generate this space of interaction with somebody else in which, through the coordinations of behavior, an operation of distinction of something independent arises. But that distinction does not take place in the bodyhood, it takes place in the relation. Okay. So reflection requires languaging. But the next thing that happens as you do this, distinguish your circumstance and contemplate it, that as you contemplate it, you put in the domain of emotions. You like it or dislike it. And this is what reflection is.
Right, so a torturer can still be reflecting on the process, but the emotion is reflecting on the consequences of inflicting torture. So that reflective process is in place.
Could be or could not. Let us suppose that it is not. He's just doing what he is told and he has to do this, bang, 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 bang. Suddenly somebody calls him to reflect. Meets someone, he has to torture someone that he knows, so she knows. And then he reflects. And then what happens is, do I want or do I not want to go on doing this? If he does not want to go on doing this, then he stops. But then he reflects, if I stop, they kill me. Do I want to be killed for this or not? Not. Then I go on doing this. And so it's a complex situation. But if this person has reflected, this will soon show up in his behavior. A torturer that reflects either accepts that he likes or she likes torturing, or will soon have to stop. Because this appears, this behavior changes. We all know when somebody that is participant in a conspiracy, now conspiracy is a very beautiful word, does not only mean bad things, means co-inspiration, being of the same breathing. But the participants of a co-inspiration are in the process, and if any one of the participants has doubts, the others immediately know. What happens to you? Slightly slower, perhaps a little bit pale when it's doing the thing that should be done with easiness. A trepidation here, a question, a mere question shows you this person has changed. It's always apparent. Reflection, once takes place, you cannot escape the consequence. But if you reflect and you like what you are doing, then of course it's you go on. So reflections arise with circumstances which are novel, which result in that you put your circumstance under contemplation, and this you put them in the domain of your emotions, your desires. When you meet someone that you love, you have not met, and when you meet someone and you see this one, reflection always arises. Isn't that interesting? You go in the street and you see a little cat. What do you do when you see a little cat in the street? You may just go, oh, little cat. Or you say, oh, look, this little cat. Oh, poor thing. It is so cold. It must be hungry. But all those commentaries are reflections on the circumstance of the little cat, isn't it? So loving, falling in love, opens space for reflection. There is nothing more dangerous socially than falling in love, because you can become a revolutionary. Yeah, because suppose suddenly you see this person, where do you work? How do they treat you? Do you have this and these conditions? Oh my goodness, you are being exploited. And then you become a person that puts question marks on the harmony of the domain of existence in which you are, because by looking at this person, this acceptance, you look at the circumstance.
I wonder if you could define health for us, and
Health.
and what part does languaging have in the maintenance of health?
Yeah. Well, as structure determines systems, everything happens in us in the flow of our structural determinism. In that sense, we are perfect systems all the time. We'll go on, maybe eventually we disintegrate, or we don't disintegrate. But there are moments in which we reflect upon how we are in our circumstance. And as we reflect upon how we are in our circumstance, then we like it or dislike it. And as we like it or dislike it, we may consider that our being in our circumstance is inadequate with respect to our expectations or to our possibilities or to other things. So there the distinction of illness may appear. So I would say that health is to live in satisfaction and harmony according to one's own living with one's circumstances. Now I may have a tumor. My friend says, look, you have to go to the doctor. But I live with this in perfect conformity, so I'm not ill. But if this person, by speaking about this, makes me think, my goodness, I should not have this, then I'm ill. And this is what indeed happens, that unless you treat your circumstance as undesirable, you just live through it as legitimate. Now, which are the circumstances under which one treats one's circumstances as undesirable? This may be relate to the community, to the conversations in which one is involved. Let us suppose that I think, just a second, that I think that these particular changes that I have in my body are of old age. They are going to happen anyhow, so I don't care. I just live them through. I'm perfectly healthy. But these other persons tell to me, no, they are not of old age. You need not have them. They have to do with this and that and that. And if I accept this, then I'm ill. The same thing with slavery. A slave is a slave not in an accepted relation of coexistence, but when the accepted relation of coexistence which restricts the movement of this person becomes unacceptable to this person for some other reason which does not pertain to the realization of these relations.
What happens where the first manifestation of this process is in loss of consciousness? Because then the person cannot reflect. Others can reflect, but he cannot.
So the others decide that he is ill or she is ill. But this frequently happens. We take care of the other. This person, look, I mean, you are ill. You should not be working. We take this person, and in the moment in which we do that, this person says, oh, you are right, I have not been feeling very well. Huh? But as soon as you make a distinction now, you make a history. You project it for the infinite past. So you become aware, you make a distinction of your dynamics which before you had not made, and this distinction, of course, allows you to make an assessment in time. So we live in the present, we make a particular reflection in the present, and we project it, making a history. That must be true. I was feeling like today, yesterday. I was not feeling well yesterday. Yes, I must have been ill already 2 or 3 days. In other moments, you realize that you are ill, and sometimes you say, how come that I did not realize that this was the case with me before? But it depends on what conversations you live. If you belong to a conversation in which men do not suffer, they are strong and they are able to face whatever it is, then these poor men do not get ill until they are very ill. Or the woman, oh, I have to do this home chores and this is my responsibility and so on and so forth. And nobody, not her, nobody else realizes that this is ill. Or we say, realizes a posteriori, when the distinction is made. Oh, she was ill. My goodness, what we have been doing with mother. We have been demanding from her all this month. She must have been ill for a month at least. So this belongs to the relations, because as we go in our operation as a structure-determined system, we just go. I sometimes tell the story of my uncle. I think it is a good moment to tell the story of my uncle. Some of you may have heard the story of my uncle, who is a very rich fellow and very ill now. I am with my brother the only inheritors. So when he dies, I shall be very rich. I shall be able to come to Australia without being invited, just by myself. But he's alive. But he's very ill. He's so ill that he has pacemaker. He has to be put in the artificial kidney 3 times a week. He has artificial respiration. He has to be fed through phlebolysis and so on and so forth. And I went the other day to the judge to say, Mr. Judge, I want to claim the inheritance because my uncle is going to die anyhow very soon, and he's dying, in fact. So he said, do you have the death certificate? No, then you cannot claim the inheritance. So my uncle is alive as long as there is no death certificate. But look, cannot go to the beach with me. Because if he goes to the beach, then he dies. Precisely, says the judge. So where he is in perfect conditions. In the hospital is precisely where he is alive. So living systems are alive while they are alive. And we cannot claim the inheritance until we have the death certificate. But sometimes we say, this poor living system is in such and such a bad shape. This is a reflection from the observer. And if this is an observer himself or herself, this living system, because participate in language, those may also think that it's in bad shape and will do something in relation to that. Things are not in one way. That pertain to the dynamics of continuous constitution as this appears in the reflection upon how living systems operate. But if we explain living systems in objectivity without parentheses, they are as they are. We restrict the dynamic, we don't see it. The dynamic that we see as we operate in objectivity in parentheses.
Like to say that conversation is also discourse, and I would beg you to use that word discourse because it's very popular with certain amount of British highly intelligent circles, and it is not altogether foolish to think that discourse is also a very elaborate kind of ritualized conversation, which comes from the consensual domain of the consensual domain. And on different consensual domains depend different kinds of discourse. I have good reasons to think that some British people might welcome inclusion of discourse in this extremely valid discussion.
Thank you very much. I agree with you because the discourse, although it appears as a presentation in language by one person, of course, pertains to a conversation. You are right. It's a feature of the operation in a conversation. So both terms must be used, but at the same time, conversation is this fundamental operation in coordinations of emotioning and languaging. A discourse is one particular form in which this has.
Conventionalized
form, yes, certainly.
Conversation. But tying it together brings, I believe, to me, this tie-up with culture and also with social consensus, which is very valuable, because to certain kinds of arrangements, such as citizenship, certain discourse belongs.
Yeah.
And you've got to accept the need. You wish to be a citizen of Australia. Therefore, you develop a certain acceptance of a certain kind of discourse. And it ties up extremely well with what you said.
Yeah, I agree. You're right. Thank you. Some other question? Yes? In the moment.
Changing the conversation from one to another. For example, from going from somewhere where peace is the conversation to going where violence is the conversation. Can you do that by only inviting someone to look at a different conversation? Violence in itself, for example, I think, is something that denies invitation.
Well, not the question that certainly makes sense. We are multidimensional beings, so we must, we interact with somebody else in various ways. We may inviting and making coercion at the same time. So as we make coercion, the invitation disappears, but then we diminish the coercion and the invitation appears. So this is a dynamic situation, and we'll go on with our emotioning. We move in one of the other of these domains according to our emotioning. And that, of course, will have to do with the discourses in which we are embedded, the conversations which we are realizing. Now, we are multidimensional beings. This is a very important thing. We tend to flatten everything because we expect things to be only one way. But one can make an invitation in one dimension, a threat in another, so we invite to some and we threat somebody else. We invite to the members of our community, we threat the members of the other community. What I say here that is proper and acceptable for all of us is heard as a threat by other people. I mean, in international affairs, this is very obvious. Somebody says in his head of government says something in his or her country, and somebody else says, oh, that was a threat to us. Well, this also happens in the particularity of our human relations too. We are multidimensional beings, and we flow from one conversation to another. We belong to networks of conversations. And in this process, our languaging and emotioning change. And our whole life goes that way, and in that process, we belong to different systems which we conserve. There are different identities which are constituted through as different conversations that we conserve. Identities of profession, identities of membership in some political party or religion or club. And what happens though is that although these identities are different, their realization intersects in our bodyhood. So what happens to us as we realize one particular identity has consequences to what happens to us in the realization of our other identities. But we are multidimensional. Yes?
Earlier you talked about evolutionizing and breaking up the harmony. Harmony is a fluid thing, isn't it?
Harmony is a fluid thing, yes?
Revolutionizing maybe belongs to the domain of politics, or in some way. I'm not quite sure about this. And how you influence people to change your harmony in some way, or without being seen to be a revolutionary or being seen as passionate. If harmony is more fluid, rather than it's always somebody revolutionary coming in and trying to break up this nice conservative harmony that's been going. Do we always have to assume that things are conservative in that way?
No, we don't have to assume that things are conservative. Systems are conservative, whether we like it or not.
But harmony can be something that's fluid, that changes with
Certainly, you see,
coming in, doing these revolutionary things, right?
if this is harmony, the congruence with the circumstance, this is changing. The way harmony is changes. I mean, the way your harmony it takes place and is realized has been changing along your life.
So it's not so fixed. Conservatism is not fixed.
No, conservation. What I mean is that a system conserves its identity through continuous change around the relations that define its identity.
It's made of glue and it's harder to move, but it's not fixed.
No, but it's not that what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that whenever you have a system, that system will exist only as long as the relations that define its identity are conserved. In that sense, systems are constitutively conservative. This does not mean, one, that they will last forever, not that they cannot disintegrate, Certainly not that there are not structural changes taking place in them. Now, some of those structural changes may result in that it disintegrates. Some are structural changes that take place with conservation of identity. And so you will see it's a changing system around the identity of the system with conservation through those changes of its harmony in existence. So what is involved here is certainly there are continuous structural changes. Some of them result in the continuous conservation of the identity of a system. Some of them result in its disintegration. We belong or we participate in the constitution of many different systems. Some of them disappear indefinitely, some of them disappear and are reconstituted, some of them change their characteristics while conserving their identity. So this is fluid. At the same time, conversations create domains of conservation, so that although it's fluid, for example, a family is conserved as a network of conversations around living together, and may be conserved for many years with many structural changes. Or a community, or a political party, or a club, or a group of friends, or a band of bandits, a factory. For example, when you read this factory was founded in 1735. What has been conserved since 1735? Or this restaurant was founded in 1735. And what has been conserved is a dynamics of relations and conversations of the persons that realize it, although the persons have changed. And in the process, some of the dishes prepared may have changed too. Yes.
Organization itself doesn't have this, is nothing material.
Yes, excuse me. Yeah, I made this distinction the other weekend. Yes, I made the distinction between organization and structure. The organization is the relations between the components that define the class identity of a particular entity, and the structure are the components and their relations that realize a particular entity as an entity of a particular kind. So the structure can change with conservation of organization, but as soon as the organization changes, the system disintegrates and something else appears. So organization is necessarily an invariant. And this is how come that systems become conservative. The system is constituted, will be conservative until it disappears. But normally a dynamic is constituted through, particularly in biological systems, that stabilize the conservation of that which defines that system. This is how lineages are formed, species are formed, through habits, for example.
Which is the identity attached to it?
To what?
If you're conserving identity, which are you conserving in structural organization?
The organization. The organization. Yes?
Doesn't it depend, obviously, on the observer again? The question of making a distinction of the identity. In other words,
Oh.
you draw forth an identity based on observation, and that's fine. But another person observing something else will
Bring something else.
bring forth a different identity, which will potentially compromise that.
Yes. Yes, that is the case. But let me expand this a little bit. This but is an expansion of that. And at the same time, maybe a little modification. The fact that the entity is brought forth by the operation of distinction of the observer does not mean that any possible fantastic operation of distinction can take place. Because, you see, in this process of explaining, we have explained here the story of these two systems interacting recurrently and transforming through recurrent interactions As this happens, and languaging arises, observing arises as the operation of living systems in language. And as this explanation takes place, then we realize that experience changes as the structure of the participants changes. So this explanation allows us to see how come that experience changes. Experience changes as the structure of the observer changes in the process of living, and changes in a manner that has to do with his or her operation as an observer. But at every moment, the observer finds him or herself in a circumstance in which it is congruent as a result of its history of living. Whatever it does arises in its dynamics, in its structural dynamics, and will take place according to the structure that it has at that moment. So you never can make a distinction which is alien to your present in the domain of structural congruence or structural coupling in which you are in that moment. So, although that which you bring forth is brought forth by the operation of the observer cannot just bring forth whatever thing. It will bring forth something that is proper to the domain of structural coupling in which the observer is in the moment in which makes the distinction.
I was thinking of a slavery analogy before, the sense of the notion of consciousness or reflection, which in a sense is bringing forth in a way a reflection which was not included in the congruence that existed prior to that point.
Yeah.
Or a stranger or an alien coming or something like that, someone who's sort of not involved, hasn't been involved.
Yeah, but then it appeared because this entailed structural changes which allowed in the participation in this conversation to that reflection to take place. But you see, we cannot make any arbitrary distinction. We can only make the distinctions that we can make according to the present of our circumstance. Now, what about literature? Well, in literature we make the distinction that we can make in the domain of operation in literature. What about poetry? Well, the poet makes a distinction in the domain of congruence in which the poet lives by grasping or abstracting coherences in that domain of living in which the poet is. At the same time, I can pick up this fellow and replace it by some other one that has the same structure. So I can take this out and put another one, and with respect to the participation in that domain is the same. Yet, if there are differences, the history will be different. Right? You change the director of this institution, with respect to certain operations, everything goes the same, and yet zoom, goes somewhere else, because there are other dimensions, other features of this person that result in that the history of interactions is different. And this is possible because we are the present of this interconnected history of structural changes, which is the biosphere or the community which we are now and to which we belong. Yes, and then?
Would you say something about the process of psychotherapy in relation to what you said about
someone who has no prior history of dealing with certain things?
I would say that what happens, I think, and this is my opinion, I'm not a psychotherapist, I don't practice psychotherapy, but I would say that what happens is that most problems, if not all of them, which do not entail some body damage as a source, are problems of emotional conflicts which arise of participation in different domains of actions that bring forth contradictory actions. And those can take place through conversations, mostly or frequently when one operates in objectivity in parentheses in relation to somebody else. I would say that generally. So what you obtain in psychotherapy is either recovery of love or coming back to operate in objectivity in parentheses.